Navigating an SAP transformation? We get it. By day, we work hands-on with people like you across the globe. By night, we share what actually works. Welcome to Transformation Every Day with Alexander Greb and Johannes Langguth, where your complex transformation becomes clear, actionable, and achievable.
Welcome everybody. My name is Alexander Greb. I'm a consulting director at CBS Corporate Business Solutions, and you're listening to Transformation Every Day, expert insights and stories on SAP and beyond. Let's start with good news. We won. Transformation Every Day has been awarded Best SAP Podcast and Show at the SAP Influencer Awards 2025. A huge thank you to everybody listening. And today's episode is the perfect way to celebrate. We're joined by Jon Reed, one of the sharpest and most trusted voices in the SAP ecosystem. Fresh off a marathon run of SAP Connect, Oracle AI World, and Constellation's Connected Enterprise, Jon arrives with a message every transformation leader needs to hear. AI isn't a miracle cure, it's an accelerant, powerful only when your data, processes, and business strategies are already in shape. AI can lift a strong transformation, but it can't fix a disorganized business. Customer service, clarity of purpose, and a holistic approach still decide who wins. AI just amplifies the system you already have. Jon cuts through hype, brings perspective, and sets the record straight. Let's jump in. So your travels, what was the last trip that you had? Was it Connect?
Yeah, so I jokingly refer to my Las Vegas residency because I was there for 12 days participating in SAP Connect and Oracle AI World back-to-back along with the Analyst days, and then left there, came home, hit a college reunion, talked to my college classmate, Gary Marcus, who's a leading figure in AI circles. Some of you will know that name. Kind of strange that was a classmate of mine. And then back out west for Constellation Connected Enterprise, which is one of my favorite events of the year, where a group of eclectic enterprise people gather. Very strange, interesting, fascinating, passionate group of practitioners join that show. I moderated a couple panels on AI, including one on vibe coding. It was really interesting. And so just back from that. So now I'm in the Bat Cave trying to make sense of everything I just heard. And I've got ASUG Tech Connect on deck next week as we head into the Tech Ed season. So for SAP watchers out there, we're kind of right in the middle of some interesting moments, right? Because, we've kind of had the SAP Connect show, which kind of made this line of business argument. And now we're heading into the Tech Ed season where I think there's a lot of big questions for SAP folks in terms of how that's going to play out. So that's what we're on the verge of. And as part of that, ASUG has their Tech Connect show for senior tech leadership in the US, which is kind of coordinated around Tech Ed. And I'll be there. And one of your recent podcast guests, Josh Greenbaum, and I will be there in person. So that'll be fun. And anyway, so that's right on deck.
It's fantastic that you mentioned Josh, because we are recording already, and I'm happy that with you I have, let's say, for me, the lost or not yet interviewed member of I may call you the Holy Trinity, or the three holy saints of SAP, of the SAP ecosystem in the US. We have Jon Reed. Happy to have you. Really awesome. Yeah. It's going to be really interesting. And let's get a quick run through your life, because you wrote something on your profile which I thought was quite interesting. It was about something you did 20 years ago, and it stated honest enterprise storytelling with increasing video professionalism. Which I thought is a quite interesting statement. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you end up in the SAP space?
In the original, it was pretty random because I was running some smaller publishing outfits locally, and then essentially a desktop publishing kind of hit a wall. The internet was about to break, and I got a job running an IT recruiting firm. And at first, the SAP resumes flying off the shelves there really caught my eye. But then what ended up happening is the owner was really into newsletters and out of desperation, kind of long story short, I realized that content was my way to make a name for myself in that field because I just really wasn't a natural salesperson. Uh, and content was always my thing. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do this because this is the only way I can really stand out. And so I started publishing ERP market analysis and issuing SAP newsletters and stuff in the 90s. And, um, and that really intersected with web publishing and community. And community ended up really being like an overriding theme for me as well throughout my career. And so it was just really interesting because um, none of that was like brilliance. It was all desperation, honestly. It was like me realizing I couldn't compete on the terms that were being set out. And so I had to compete based on what I was good at and try to shoehorn my way in. And it ended up being a really valuable lesson. And, looking forward, the really fascinating thing is how I got really lucky in a certain sense because content and community turn out to be really, really important to buyers and how buyers assess software. And I've written a book about that. It's still underestimated by a lot of people, but I think it's incredibly important, the health of an ecosystem. And we could talk a little bit about, how that stacks up with SAP and all. But then eventually through all of that, I got into this sort of Web 2.0 thing where I started doing podcasts in 2008. I was taping them off of a speakerphone in my apartment. Shout out to Jim Spath, an old community member himself who kind of taught me a little bit about that. I was taping into a Zoom recorder, but I just love that format. And I'm actually a little daunted being on your podcast because you've done some of the best podcasts I've been on in a long time. So we'll see if I can live up to that. But anyways, so like, I
That's nice.
decided preparing for this podcast that I was just going to, you set such a high bar. I'm just going to try to just be incredibly honest and see how I do.
That's everything that I expect from you. Thank you very much about that.
Sure.
um, uh, Talking about the community and the conversation you have, since we both of us, already probably are counting amongst the more veterans of the community. How do you perceive the conversation? Are they still the same in your opinion? Like 20 years ago, like how to get value out of technology, how to leverage potential and so on, or did it change in a certain way?
So at its best, it's still the same. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's not at its best anymore. And you can throw SAP under the bus a little bit for this, but honestly, some of it is also broader trends. And communities have just become much more fragmented, harder to cultivate right now. And the social mega sites sort of dominate the conversation. And I find most of the stuff going on LinkedIn pretty discouraging rather than inspiring. And unfortunately, that's the
Agree.
dominant platform, and we're kind of compelled to participate. And I do like some of the live stuff I do on that platform, like the watch parties for keynotes I've been doing, but it's just not what it was for me. And like I think it's important for me to kind of bring up to date what happened because so I got really entrenched in all of that because I ended up becoming an SAP mentor pretty early in that program, and for many many years I was part of it. And that was on the backs of things like the SAP Developer Network, which already existed at that time. And that was the earliest days of web community, and there was so much palpable energy around community at that time, and it really felt tremendous to be a part of it. I mean, those were the days where like when you had to miss SAP Tech Ed for whatever reason, like you were kind of heartbroken, like
Yeah.
because so much amazing stuff was happening. And
Mhm.
I don't want to get too nostalgic, but you can remember the days of walking into an SAP Tech Ed, the coffee section, getting a big hug from someone like Marilyn Pratt. And then you'd have these expert networking sessions where people were throwing up whiteboards and on the fly creating sessions and gathering and having these passionate conversations. And the sad thing is that enterprise software vendors have really lost track of that stuff, and it still matters. It's like community engagement is at the heart of what a healthy ecosystem looks like. And it's kind of sad when you realize that you've lost some of that and you can't figure out how to rekindle it. And as far as the mentor program is concerned, while from the best of my understanding, it still exists pretty well and still functions okay. It's not the cutting edge program that it once was, where, when Mark Finner was part of the starting of that as the first lead, he was inviting people in like me who didn't really fit in in a classic way. He invited the legendary Dan Hallett, who was an SAP critic more than a enthusiast a lot of the time. He took some real chances. And at the time, the SAP mentors were much more public in their criticisms of the company, which I thought were actually a very healthy dynamic for SAP. So anyway, so I was a mentor for a long time, and I was taping my own podcast and doing my own thing as an independent voice of sorts. And then when we started Diginomica, which is now about 13 years ago, a bunch of things came to a head for me. And one of them was that I was about to really realize my dream, which was to really be a true journalist in the space. And what that meant was I had to pull out of community a little bit. I had to accept that my craft and the truth of my reporting comes first, and that I would have to hurt some feelings at times. And I had to essentially let go of a lot of friendships and say, if the friendships prosper in my new role, that's great. But a journalist has to choose their craft over their friends. I know that sounds harsh, but it's just a reality of that profession. And the timing in some ways was good because I felt like the mentor program had kind of jumped the shark for me personally in terms of what I loved about the program. And that gets back to my passion for that type of old school community feeling. And anyway, so in the course of Diginomica, about halfway through, I became more and more conscious of wanting to also really be an analyst, because most of the most challenging and interesting personalities that I met were the analysts, and they were always the people in the room that made me think the hardest. And I wanted to be one of those people that like help people separate the signal from the noise and really make sense of it all. And so that's sort of this journey that I've been on professionally, to try to become this analyst and to really throw myself also into AI and also to look at just so many vendors, not just SAP. And I do think it's made my SAP engagement better, ironically enough. But I'm not going to say that was always easy to make that transition. In some ways, I miss the close friendships and camaraderies of some of those days. But, what I can do now that I couldn't do then is when an SAP executive says, we're the only ones to do that, I can say, well, actually, Oracle was doing that for 3 years and blah, blah, blah. And you can have some really interesting back and forth around that, because they're not necessarily right now used to those types of discussions, because unfortunately the state of tech media isn't great. So there's not a whole lot of rigorous challenging going on. So anyway, it's a really fun, fascinating time in my career, and I feel very, very blessed. But it's very different than those days. And so, when you get back to the core of your question, which is, yes, all those things that you talked about still matter. And the question is, how do you find new ways of getting that back without being crippled by nostalgia? Because the old days aren't coming back, but those conversations still really matter. And, my real excitement comes when I see, for example, peers of customers sharing war stories together and at shows, and figuring out how you cultivate those moments. But mostly, those moments happen on the margins of shows, because the keynotes are so often front and center, and it's all about messaging. And you and I talked before we started taping about how things can get so formal with like how we relate to partners and how we relate to people in communities. And that's not just an SAP problem, by the way, which is one thing I can maybe do on our podcast, is kind of provide some perspective on, because sometimes I think people feel like, oh, SAP this, SAP's going to crap or whatever. And it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of vendors that are struggling with these issues. And one thing that SAP still has is it still has probably the most vibrant user group communities in the enterprise by a wide margin. I don't know of another vendor like it, which is not to say that the user group communities are perfect. We could have a whole podcast on why they're not. But that was one of the things that I continued to do in my coverage, which is I work a lot with both ASUG, but I also am connected with UK ISUG and the German user group a lot. And I wish, honestly, I could work with more of them, because I'm trying to form these unholy alliances to try to surface truths that matter to customers. And that was one reason why I was so thrilled that you reached out to me, because as we form these relationships, we can become a stronger voice to echo what the priorities should be for customers and partners. And hopefully we can do that responsibly, because a lot of folks in their day-to-day, they either don't have time to do this, or they honestly don't want to take the heat by putting themselves out there.
Absolutely. And to what you're doing, I want to add that, and I want to encourage everybody that is listening to also join that. You and Josh and some other guests that join you in that respective, you have this awesome watch parties of great SAP events, which, to be honest, for me are a must attend. In the meantime, because especially also in events where I was present and so on and listened to the keynotes there. I went then after the spec and listened to your watch parties because I wanted to know your opinion about that. Yeah, what do Josh and John think about that? And that shows how important your opinion is in that way, because you are very outspoken, you're very professional, and neutral in that way. But there's also, of course, something what I want to refer to what you said. You said it has lost something. Do you also think that maybe, let's say, everybody's living, of course, in bubbles, and the bubble that we are living in the SAP world has become more intransparent in the past? Because we want to talk today also a little bit about the competitive situation. And when you listen around and ask around in the SAP world with partners and so on, actually not many people really know what is going on in the competitive world. Yeah, what's happening at Oracle, what is happening at Salesforce, what's happening at Workday, and so on and so on. Do you think this is or has become, let's say, worse than in the past in that way, that there is actually not really also an interest about what is happening there?
It's a good question. I mean, SAP is, for SAP professionals, it's a really bad time to hunker down too much inside of SAP and even maybe call it the SAP bubble or whatever. And you and I know people who are all SAP all the time, and it's not a really good time to have that outlook. There's so much going on in AI. It was fun listening to your podcast with Josh, because I do disagree with Josh a fair amount about AI. Maybe we could continue a little bit that later in this conversation. For example, when Josh refers to generative AI only solving 50-cent problems, I can give you some examples of some problems that are way more than 50 cents. And I'm not a generative AI advocate. I want to be clear about that. I'm as much of a critic in some ways, but I think that's a overly simplistic view of what's happening now in AI. But it's so potent that you need to understand it. And so much of what I look for in leaders, and by leaders I don't just mean executives. I mean anyone who wants to have impact on their projects and have impact on transformations. I look for an outside in perspective. Like, so if you're an enterprise architect, I'm interested in your knowledge of evolving enterprise architect standards. I'm interested in what you know about open source projects in your area. I don't just want to hear about Cloud ALM and Solution Manager. I want to hear that you have perspective on those things, because I think that's going to help you make a better contribution. So I think it's always been. I don't know if there's a difference now, but I just think there's more urgency than ever to have a broader context in which you're operating in. And, how SAP fits into that context, of course, is the critical issue, because like SAP is not going to go away. I mean, what is at the heart of SAP's leadership concerns is they don't want to become like the next IBM. I mean, it's kind of ironic because SAP's roots, right, are stem from moving some innovative thinkers inside of IBM and such, ex-IBMers who kind of created this new wave of enterprise software. And they've had like a really good run. And we could talk about some of the mistakes and some of the things they missed and some things they got right. But what they want to do now going forward is SAP still wants to be perceived as a strategic partner in how companies transform. And will they succeed in that? Or will they really become more of a back office repository that's accessed via APIs and agentic workflow automations and stuff like that? That's not the future that SAP wants. And so it's not a question really of whether SAP will survive or not. It's a question of how strategic will those relationships be. And when you look at it, that's what every enterprise software vendor is struggling with right now, is how to really be that trusted partner. And The fascinating thing about AI, the pros and cons of it, it's more tied to trust than almost any other technology because the stakes are so high. And I've written a lot about that lately around what does trust look like in that context. And so all the vendors out there are trying to get at that. And I find it fascinating to compare and contrast the different strategies.
Hi there. Quick break for a short message before we go right back to the episode. Enjoying the insights and stories on transformation every day? Want to make sure you never miss an episode packed with practical tips and best practices from the SAP world, featuring conversations with some of the most interesting people in the SAP universe? Then hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform, whether it is Apple, Spotify, or any other you use. And if our podcast brings you value, we would be incredibly grateful if you could leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends and colleagues. Your support means the world to us. Thanks so much and happy listening. Which is a good segue. Strategies. You are collecting at the moment a lot of frequent flyer miles, or whichever program you have joined, or probably many programs of those carriers. One of the latest travels led you to Connect. And when we look into Sapphire and Connect, the topic I think is very, very clear this year is definitely AI. How do you perceive what is happening at the moment? Is this all buzz? Is this just, let's say, name dropping? Is it just, let's say, putting old or new words which are AI-ish on old things? Or is it really something where you say, like, hey, this is an additional gear that we have been put into? Because I was lately talking to a customer of mine, and he's a little bit, I would not say skeptical, but of course he's careful concerning certain things, and he's quite at the moment reminded at the .com time when everything was .com. You remember the mysub.com logo was suddenly for a certain amount of time the logo of SAP before they rolled back. Is it a similar hype now as back then, or do you think that no, this is a complete different game we're playing?
So I think one of the things that help sort out like bubbles is adoption. So if you compare like AI to metaverse and blockchain, it's not even close in terms of the cultural impact. Now, blockchain, obviously crypto is a notable blockchain use case, and crypto has had some effect and it will be a factor going forward. But the revolution around blockchain, like changing everything, didn't happen. And the metaverse, of course, remains a niche environment despite Meta's fantasies to the contrary and all of that. They just exhorted all of their metaverse workers to work 5x their productivity. So we'll see how that goes. But but anyway, AI is different. AI is having massive cultural impact for better, and I would argue often for worse. But when you look at it, first of all, the algorithmic economy has been driven by AI for many years, and so all of our social networks are driven on algorithms that I would argue are probably unhealthy for discourse, but that's all AI. And then the new round of generative AI and stuff, the adoption of these tools across everything from coding to therapy and all of this, it's big. People use these tools. Kids use these tools. I do workshops with college students on this. They're using these tools. So I get honestly pretty impatient with people who say like, oh, this is not a thing. That's just ridiculous. I'm not saying that's what your customer was saying. They were saying, I think your customer was saying something different. And what is a fact though is that the valuations around the big AI companies are potentially unsustainable. And that's where the questions of the bubble come in, because it's difficult to make money in this context, and that could be a .com parallel where a lot of .coms were not able to demonstrate profitability to go along with their adoption, and the big AI companies are struggling with that right now. We could have an hour-long conversation if you wanted about that, but I don't think we should. But one thing I would really do is to step away from the bubble stuff a little bit and to say, well, that's going to have to play out over time. There's a lot of concerns about circular investments because now when you have NVIDIA and OpenAI and Oracle all doing deals with each other and stuff, you start to worry about where that could land. So in that sense, yes, there's a bubble conversation you could have. But what's really interesting is the enterprise conversation, because in the enterprise was historically a laggard with technology. So when you look at, it was slow to incorporate the internet meaningful. It was slow to incorporate mobile in a meaningful way. In AI, it's slow to some extent as well, but I would argue in good ways, because a lot of the consumer AI has been released irresponsibly, ineffectively. You could just pick a profession like law, where all these lawyers have gotten in trouble by submitting content that was inaccurate and just kind of like move fast, break things, embarrass yourself, is like,
Yeah.
because these tools out of the box, LLMs, are not good enough for a lot of enterprise use cases. But what the enterprise is doing, which is really interesting and why I study these vendors, is they're constraining LLMs in two very notable ways. One is through context, and context is about providing large language models with very specific customer and business context for their situation. So all of the major vendors, including SAP, spend a lot of time on context. But second, the other constraint and the smart ways to do this is not necessarily to use generative AI in a standalone way, like to write an email or a sales proposal, but in compound processes. So you combine that with some machine intelligence, you combine it with some proven forms of robotic process automation, you connect the dots. So the reason why it makes sense sometimes for companies like SAP is they have the data to do that, they have the platform to do that. So you could cynically say, well, they're taking advantage, they're just layering AI onto old stuff. Maybe there's some of that, and there is some AI washing, but there's also a valuable amount of tools and resources that can be invoked by so-called agents to make for better processes. And it gets really interesting. I mean, much more interesting than the so-called, 50 cent type of problems that you and Josh were discussing. And there is a lot of that 50 cent stuff still out there, but that was sort of the initial wave of generative AI. And I'm seeing a lot of stuff that isn't that. And I had some really interesting exposure to industrial AI use cases this year, which we could talk a little bit more about, but they have to do with like really creating agents that are very specific, for example, to various concerns around managing suppliers or reviewing legal documents, things like this. These are not small things. These are important, and they, the return on that could potentially be good. But one of the tricks with AI, especially agentic AI, is that it's very expensive. So when you get into evaluating ROI around these new technologies, you do have to look really, really hard at the cost of implementing them as well, and how that fits into vendor pricing is a whole nother topic. And I don't happen to think SAP's AI pricing is all that easy to understand or use, so that I think that creates some problems too.
If you remain on those critics way at the moment, you hear a lot of people saying about, okay, we may are at the moment in a, let's say, AI 1.0 phase, since what we are doing, like you also stated, we add AI to certain things. We have something like in AI enabled solutions, which in the end, of course, tend to be in the optimization way. You make things more efficient, because you do automatization and so on and so on. Still, AI 2.0, when you ask what could be that said, okay, that would have to be AI native, which would mean that you build everything with AI at the core, which in the end mean you do not need any processes, industry solutions, and so on anymore, because this is then what the AI agent is trained. Yeah. And so in the end, you have something like a black box again.
Okay, yeah, but I wouldn't even agree with that AI native approach. It's not going to work because AI agents are not reliable narrators in terms of executing bulletproof transactions. So an AI native ERP, it's not even a conceptual concept that makes sense. I know that the AI fanboys and fangirls will tell you that it will, but look at there's a reason why SAP, Oracle, Workday, and the like have done pretty well in the stock market, it's because they're sitting on data and transactions that do matter. Now, I will grant you that that there is the potential to create new user interfaces, and if you own the user interaction, that can change the vendor hierarchy, right? So, for example, that's what ServiceNow is counting on. ServiceNow wants to kind of become your portal into everything that you do, and so that does relegate different vendors to a different place within that context. I think there's some problems with that vision currently because the agent-to-agent communication protocols are simply not going that well right now. So that gets back to why SAP has some advantages with the end-to-end strategy. But I think it might be helpful to take this back a little bit to your transformation conversations. You've done such a good job on this channel, because one of the reasons why some of the customers I talk with and SAP is going to hate this part, but sorry, Workday and even Oracle are compelling to me, is because they've gone through a discipline of SaaS transformation, right? So it's not that SaaS is necessarily better than on-premise software per se. I mean, it is a lot easier to plug in things like third-party banking services and things like that to cloud-oriented protocols. But it's really more that the discipline that gets imposed on a data level, and also when you transform your company around doing business in a better way and build a better data platform, it doesn't just serve AI, it serves the analytics needs of your users. I think it's important to step back from agents and say that a proper data platform serves so many purposes. It helps you to make better decisions, which is a different part of the conversation. It helps you to automate workflows. It helps you to streamline processes. Like, all of these things are important. And so the most important thing is not the new technology, it's where your overall transformation stands, and how messy and siloed is your landscape, which gets back to your Josh conversation and some of the best parts of that conversation, and the realities of all those silos and how much they interfere with it. And so the best way to think of AI is really as an accelerant, which is, it's like lighter fuel in a way. And if you have a really well-structured transformation and process with a strong data platform and you're serving the heck out of your customers, adding AI into that mix is going to be great. But if you're going to have to do it judiciously, but it's going to help you. But if you don't have that, you can't, and this maybe gets to your customer's point, you can't just take AI and fix that stuff with it. It doesn't work that way. You can't make up for the fact that you haven't organized your business in a way to compete. And so one of my big criticisms of transformation conversation in the SAP ecosystem, including how SAP does them, is that you have to start without technology. You have to start with your stakeholders and say, how are we going to compete in our industry going forward? Do we need to be connecting directly with our end customers, or are we going to go through our distributors in the future? And if we're going to go directly with customers, how are we going to do that? And what do we want to be known for in the market? And are we going to be the kind of company that cultivates happy employees that are fulfilled? Or are we going to turn this into a surveillance workplace where these digital exhaust tools and AI end up monitoring them all the time and just burning them out and driving them into the ground? What kind of values do we have? And all of this matters. And you have to make those decisions independently of any technology. And that's where I think you have to start with all of this. And once you do that, that's where the stories start to look really good. And one of the things I wanted to mention in this conversation, which we can maybe get into a little more before we wrap, is that the best SAP stories I've documented in the last couple of years are by far the public cloud stories. And, I was actually privileged enough to be at Sapphire last spring and hear, public cloud customers tell those stories. And then I think the year before, I actually had a customer exhorting other customers to go to the public cloud and explaining why it's so like potent and meaningful as a platform. And so SAP does have some of those stories too, but the difference between SAP and some of its big SaaS competitors is SAP has so much happening with the private cloud. And while I understand why, those stories haven't been as compelling to me as the public cloud stories. And I could get into a little bit about what that's all about. But anyway, the point being, like, there's a whole lot going on right now in the transformation space that AI doesn't render that work irrelevant. And so that's where I want to start, is do you have the right business model and strategy? Do you treat your people the right way? Do you have the right processes? And then you can start figuring out how AI fits into that. But the big takeaway from Sapphire into Connect is SAP is making this argument around the flywheel, and we're going to get sick of hearing about the flywheel. Okay. And I'm not the biggest, I'm not going to go get a flywheel t-shirt. Like I'm not, but the whole point, SAP is trying to argue that data applications into AI create a distinct advantage, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's going to make that case. And I think to some extent, it all sounds good. The problem, of course, is that it does involve things like the business data cloud, business technology platform, moving to some kind of cloud environment for SAP to realize all the benefits. And so the question then becomes, how many customers are going to go with SAP on that journey versus with other providers and all of that. But that's sort of the case. And then on top of that, SAP is making an end-to-end case that we're your end. We have a unique ability to serve you in these needs with our end-to-end processes. And so those are the claims we need to evaluate and make sense of if we're SAP customers.
When you said, when you jumped in about, it's not like AI will save you from anything. Yeah, you have to have the ideas, you
Yep.
have to have the strategies. Do you think we are at the moment in a state where there is technology plenty available, but we are missing the imagination and the vision of actually how to make the best out of it? And the question why I ask you is that I, to be honest, had never really any problems in my former job at SAP to find enough information or to find enough engagement about the what question, yeah, the why and the how question, yeah, which more or less cares about the, let's say, what is the situation, what's your strategy, why should you do that, and how you really are able to embrace these benefits. There is quietness, and this is not really better now than it has been 5 years ago. Does this mean, in your opinion, that all this technology that is built at the moment will never bloom in the way it is intended because the imagination to really make something out of it is lacking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of the customers I wrote about on the public cloud, Western Sugar, it's worth looking some of those references up on Diginomica because I wrote about them on a panel and then I went in depth with their public cloud. But I found it really compelling. But one of the interesting things is that the most compelling use cases I've written about this year are mostly not about use of AI. Like it's mostly, and the theme there is that modern software is actually pretty good. Like,
Mhm.
like you don't need agents to get a lot of value out of modern software. And so ERP has come a long way. And I spent a lot of time in the ERP mid-market space as well. And it's really interesting to see how those vendors approach it. And one of my favorites that I really analyze carefully is Acumatica because the reason I do that is because about 70% of their new customers are going right into an industry solution ERP. And you say, okay, what's the big deal about industry ERP? Well, the big deal is because what I call it the death of the green screens, but it's basically about
Mhm.
like historically you had proprietary industry systems running alongside your ERP, right? So, okay, I've got my restaurant system or I've got my MES system or I've got whatever it is that's proprietary to my industry. That's not workable anymore. Like in the so-called age of analytics, AI, and all of that, you need to get rid of these like massive silos and run everything on the same like solution platform. And so that's a really, really big deal. And if you do that right, that's really potent. And then you throw in some low code, no code tooling. By the way, no AI, yet throw in that and now you're building workflows quickly. That's really powerful. So this whole idea of like, oh, we need and this is where I think Josh and I do agree is that, you don't need a lot of AI to do that. And then you could sprinkle in some, machine learning predictive algorithms and stuff like that, which have been around for a long time and start managing churn better and all of that. So much of this is really about organizational will and the desire to change. And, that was this amazing conversation you had with Christine, right? That's her name. Is that right? around
to sync them.
transformation,
Yeah.
which all of your listeners should go back to if they missed, because I think you get it. We don't need to repeat all of that now, but that's at the heart of everything still, and that doesn't change. And so the will to change comes first. If you want to change, there's so much potent technology out there. And then the question for SAP customers becomes like, how does SAP fit into that? How strategic is it? How core is it? And how much are we going to modernize our SAP systems, and to what extent are we going to do that now versus later? And yes, SAP does have deadlines that affect these decisions, but if I'm talking with customers, I tell them to step back from deadline panic and think of it differently, because I am really, really worried about customers kind of making frantic moves to deal with pending deadlines, and I don't think that's a smart play. SAP is going to hate this part too, but third-party maintenance providers have extended this until at least 2040. I'm not saying go third party. I'm just saying, like, step back a little bit from the crush to just do something that's deadline motivated and look at what you really need to do. Because one thing you can make a huge mistake about is just doing a lift and shift and missing the opportunity to have these important conversations across your line of business on where are we going, because it's hard to retrofit that stuff later.
The same with this same concern, that discussion with when you drive and you have problems like in the rain to get control of your car, there's a tree and you look all the time at the tree, you will hit the tree with your car.
Yeah.
And the same with these deadline discussions. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But still, when you're talking about public cloud, when you talk about the best stories in that way, what has brought people, and we had conversations with Michael Sokolek, for example, about that in the podcast too. When you look at, and there's in the install base almost no customer, no adopter who is safe from that. When you have used how SAP was, of course, also selling its solutions in the past 20 years, which is as a platform, when you have used it as that, when you have built your own perfect world on the solution, it can happen, of course, in a certain way you come to the point where you realize, I'm quite now locked in, in that kind of complexity and the kind of individuality. And SaaS or public cloud is seen now for many as a way out, because it's like the personal trainer who teaches you discipline concerning fit to standard. It teaches you discipline concerning your updates. It teaches you discipline in the case of get up and make something out of the last release of the innovations you get. Is this something, or let's say a concentration on these kinds of dimensions, something that could deviate away from that stupid deadline discussion into something which brings you much more into the direction that we also talk about, which is purpose, which is possibilities, and which is actually going into action, do something and get forward?
Yeah, and I think that's the benefit, right, of the deadline discussion, is to provoke you into having a deeper, more meaningful discussion, and then you can return to that deadline discussion once you've had that deeper conversation that I think you're alluding to. And I'm not going to sit here and say that you can never run an effective private cloud environment, because look, some companies in certain industries are going to have to do that for regulatory purposes. And most of the big SaaS vendors, even the ones that are really emphasizing public cloud, are, because of data sovereignty reasons, offering private instances and stuff like that. And it's not just SAP that owns those topics, by the way. but in general, like, I think the thing that is potent about public cloud is that it forces the conversation on standardization and differentiation to happen in a much more jugular way. You can't put it off. You have to do it. And sometimes customers need a little bit of a nudge there. And, the customer isn't always right in ERP. I'm sorry. The customer's not always right. I know it sounds horrible, because I'm big on amplifying customer concerns, but customers got themselves into a lot of the technical debt. Now, you can blame some of the services partners as well, because a lot of the service partners happily took on that work instead of advising customers and having a much more disciplined conversation on which customizations they really needed versus the ones that were just self-indulgent and quickly out of date. But they had those conversations, and like, reviewing this Western Sugar thing, it's just so powerful about the imposition of these standard processes and how healthy that discussion was, and the extensibility they were able to use on BTP for the areas that they did need. And when you read all of that, it's just what shines through is the passion of the customer. And then last year at ASUG Tech Connect, I went to a gathering of Rise customers, and I was hoping to hear that same passion. And honestly, I didn't.
Okay.
Now, look, there are some good Rise use cases, and we've documented on Diginomica this year. I think we probably have maybe around 5 or 10 of them that are pretty good. And I'm not saying that everyone has to move to the public cloud or anything like that, but the Rise stories haven't energized me as much, and I think I know some of the reasons why. Because last year, there were a lot of customers in this room at this meeting. Now, I want to say that Rise has come a long way, because when Rise started, it talked about transformation as a service or whatever. And by the way, I'm not using Rise the way SAP is using it now. Now SAP is including public cloud in the context of Rise.
Exactly.
It's all very complicated, but I'm using it in the private cloud context in which it originally started. It was called transformation as a service, but it wasn't really. And now at least things like the so-called tool chain have come a long way. I'm not as excited about the tool chain as Josh, and we could get into why. I don't think is as integrated as SAP would like us to believe, but SAP spent a lot more time kind of creating a meaningful value proposition around what you get with Rise. And I think it has improved a lot from its announcement. So I do want to say that. But what I heard a lot from customers were things around the so-called RACI spreadsheet, which is still an incredibly cumbersome process of dividing responsibilities between the customer, the hyperscaler, and SAP. And SAP is aware of my issue with this, because I've been giving them a hard time this year about it, because I'm like, where is AI here? Why are we still filling out a spreadsheet? Why can't we be at least having an interactive interface to start allocating responsibilities around this topic? But the point is, that doesn't sound cutting edge to me, like hand wringing over who does what. Like we should be just pressing the go button here, and that's what you hear from the public cloud stories. So and look, I think SAP is going to figure out how to make Rise like even more compelling. So I'm giving a state of where we are right now, but that's the contrast that I see there, and I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that it's not just SAP, it's also the customers on Rise dictating their own pace and maybe not pushing their own transformations hard enough. And SAP is doing a good job on the clean core side of saying, look, your transformation's not done once you get on Rise. You need to keep pushing. I mean, you just had Jan Gilg on your podcast. Jan's been really great at articulating the clean core concepts and all of that. And you have some good clean core episodes that folks should listen to. But like, that hasn't always been internalized very well by customers either.
Absolutely.
And we can get to the partner side of that as well, by the way. But
that's a complete different chapter, which you can talk us for an hour. But what you said is interesting in that way, when you state like the public cloud is a happy train. To be honest, I'm also a late believer. To be honest, concerning the public cloud, because I have experienced the start of it, and I was a little bit skeptical, because I said, like, okay, you have differentiating processes, you have standard processes, commodity processes. How do you want to move into that? Because SAP in a certain way just copied at first, the Salesforce strategy in that way, before something like the cloud platform, as it was called back then, happened, which evolved into that side-by-side scenario thing. But still, I think what gets not enough room, in my opinion, is the evolvement of the capabilities and of the power of the public cloud out of, hey, we are something for the net new names and for the, let's say, service companies, into a full-blown suite, which is absolutely adaptable for product-centric customers. My company, we have very, very many interesting cases of end-to-end producing and logistic active companies brought by us full onto the public cloud. And this is something which definitely, in my opinion, should get more airtime in our, let's say, at the moment, very by AI noise covered ears. Because there may be, of course, still some knockout criteria, but public cloud is an option. And it's a very good option that basically anybody should take a look at.
100%. And look, I mean, if you start kicking ass on the public cloud the way you're describing, that the AI stuff is going to get delivered to you, and you're going to get have a chance to incorporate it into your SAP
Yeah.
environment, and that's one of the best ways to start getting used to what AI can and
Yeah.
can't do for you. And AI creates a different kind of software mentality because you really have to iterate on AI. You can't really do waterfall because
Yeah.
of how the data and the models behave. And so there's culture changes involved with that. And that's one reason why it's valuable to get started in the context of a chosen vendor, whether it's SAP or some other type of vendor, and get going on that. And the public cloud is if you set the stage for that, SAP has been very upfront. I've documented this in my articles. Philip Herzig has said more than once, like, we
Yeah.
deliver first to the public cloud. Like,
Yeah.
but I take it back to the passion of the customers, Alexander, because I hear passionate public cloud stories that excite me. That gets my attention. And now there is more that SAP could do to make it easier to get into the
Mhm.
public cloud, and we could talk about that. But one thing I really do like is that SAP has gotten more aggressive in the last couple of years. You hear, Thomas Sauersig, he talks more about the public cloud, and we talk about like how, for example, like it's not just a subsidiary play. Like they are positioning it more aggressively than a subsidiary play, which is good.
One thing when you say that, and I really have to point on that now, comes into my mind when you say like the more happier, the more, let's say, dynamic discussions and dynamic excitements are happening in the public cloud space. Isn't it, or can it be that it's a chicken egg topic, that is it because public cloud helps those companies to become happy, or is it that the companies who are more dynamic are the ones who have the urge and the desire and the understanding to move to the cloud?
Good question. I think it's probably a combination of the two,
Yeah.
right? Like that public cloud adopters are going to have some of that aggressive early adopter energy, and so that can be a little bit infectious as well. But all I'm saying is that when I go onto these shows from different vendors, like the things that I really look at are like the health of the ecosystem, and I think you might be interested in hearing how I evaluate that. And then the passion of certain customers and what their stories look like. And all I'm saying is that I'm struck by that when I hear it. And when I hear a public cloud customer literally exhorting other customers in the room, like, to not go private cloud until they look really hard, and why aren't you looking at SAP public cloud? That gets my attention, because when customers start advocating aggressively for your products, you're doing something right.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that Rise private cloud edition shouldn't be there. I understand why it's there and why customers might want that choice, but I'm just saying, I think that there's way more that everyone should be talking about on the public cloud side. And if you do those things and handle those things, and if you pay attention to SAP's flywheel concepts, whether you use that term or never use it in your life, pay attention to the health of your data, your apps, and how you incorporate any new technology, including AI. I like your chances, but it has to start with this like core understanding of who you are as a company and how you're going to compete. And it's really important because, I mean, you know, some of these tools can be used to rationalize massive headcount reductions. And
Mhm.
really, you can play the Amazon game and play hardball all the time if you want, or you can compete against that. You got to figure out who you are as a company before you make any of these decisions. And to me, that's one of the big takeaways. And as far as the health of the ecosystem, one of the big things I'm looking for is, are the smallest partners discoverable, and are
Yeah.
they visible, and do the vendor promote those smaller partners? Because if the smaller partners are happy, then everyone's happy. And honestly, right now, I'm not real thrilled with the state of the smaller partners in the SAP ecosystem. Now, I will say that it's a problem in a lot of vendor ecosystems right now, the smaller partners. So it's not just SAP that's having this problem, but I think SAP has a long way to go in terms of reducing the friction and increasing the discoverability of the smaller partners. And you say, well, John, why do you care about the smaller partners? Well, because a lot of them are the ones that are building the most innovative and important last mile solutions. And you have to have those. You need very specific solutions for industries and micro verticals. And smaller partners often deliver incredible value propositions, and they deserve airtime. And so I think SAP's got a long way to go there, and a lot of partners are still struggling to transition to the kind of business models you and I are talking about today.
When you talk about the partners, one thing that I've heard from several people is that the differences, for example, that you have when you look, for example, to Europe and to the US, that the US customers tend to go more, let's say, first or standard wise to the big four as a first point of contact in that areas. Why?
Yeah.
Customers in Europe do not necessarily do that, because they have maybe longer relationships with some of the smaller ones, etc., which is something that in the US makes some of the smaller ones struggle in a certain way, of course. Yeah. Do you perceive it that too? And what would be your recommendation to them to get out of the shadow of the big four?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, I think customers really vary in terms of how open they are to look at like new solutions. And, a lot of it comes down to the fact that you have to really get rid of a stale event model of like someday we can afford a booth. And
Mhm.
yeah, you want to be in the app store and all of that. But you got to get really creative and punch above your weight if you're a smaller partner. And I think industry specialization is really, really important. And so if I'm a smaller partner, I'm probably really working really hard on industries, and really trying to go to industry related events, and really get to, if I'm in retail, I want to meet retail customers. I should probably be at NRF meeting retail customers, even if it's not an SAP specific show. So some of it is like really like realizing that. And then the other thing is realizing that you have an advantage as a smaller partner, because attention, so there's a few ways to get attention, but one of the best ways to do it without doing viral crap is just by having strong opinions. And a lot of smaller partners do better with strong expert content that has a very strong point of view, because bigger partners, they get caught up in all these approval cycles with content. Some of them are getting a little better with this, but
Mhm.
stuff comes out stale from them. Whereas a smaller partner can issue something critical of SAP. Now, smaller partners have to be a little careful about that, because I've seen a few smaller partners that will just go full on criticizing SAP, and you get to a point where it's so negative that it's like, well, why are you even a
Yeah,
partner? And I don't
exactly.
think customers don't want that. They want some harmony on their project, so they don't want to bring in, SAP integrated software integrating with SAP with people that are hostile to the SAP brand. That doesn't work. Like so part of it is showing like how you can actually fulfill some of the promise of the platform. But occasionally I think it is appropriate to say like SAP currently doesn't solve this problem, even though they say they do, they don't, or at least they don't in this industry or in this situation. And here's why,
Yeah.
and here's what we do. So you can punch above your weight a little bit, but look, it's tricky. Like I said, I mean, I have these conversations with Oracle and with Workday as well. I met with Workday's partner lead and I said, like, look, like, for the next like Workday event, like I really want to see some of your smaller partners on your keynote stage. No one likes to hear that from me. They
Yeah.
they don't want to like, and they have all these objections as to, not Workday
Mhm.
specifically, but vendors have always object when I say that, like, oh, we can't put these at Sapphire, but maybe we can do that at TechEd or whatever. I'm like, well, TechEd's a start, but actually Sapphire is where they belong. And if
Yeah.
you can't find like 5 minutes on your keynote stage for innovative smaller partners, then what are you doing? Like, I'm sorry, but you can do it. You could give each one of them like 60 seconds, like speed dating almost. Tell us what's awesome about your solution. You think
Yeah.
the smaller partners would you think that wouldn't be entertaining for customers? I mean,
Yeah.
heck, you could even have people vote on it if you want, whatever. Like you gamify the thing if you want. It could be really cool. But the point is that none of the vendors listen to me. They don't do it. And I'm like, I don't understand why you wouldn't do that, because it shows that your ecosystem is dynamic and active, and
Mhm.
that's what we want out of an apps ecosystem, right? Is everyone's contributing and making a difference and getting visibility, and no one listens to me, so I don't know. I'm howling into the wind.
And yeah, I fully agree. And definitely some of the smaller partners are also in their own way because they try then to retreat to that kind of independent route, which I think is a
Right.
two-sided sword because independence is definitely necessary for everybody. Otherwise, you are just an affiliate or something like that. But to be honest, in many cases, and I have been heavily criticized about that statement, but for me, the word independence in that context is quite of nothing else than I miss to build up a network within SAP.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly what comes out. On the other hand, and I fully agree with you, because that's also what I thought, for example, was one of the weaknesses of Sapphire, to find out that EY also has transformation issues. Yeah, was not really, in my opinion, time very well spent in that keynote. I think there would have been smaller partners with much more exciting transformation stories, which would have moved the needle also for SAP even more. But definitely, like you said, probably there should be much more noise from smaller partners, and they should get out of their holes much more, not to hide. Yeah, because there are interesting stories to tell. Let me segue a little bit to a topic which I definitely want not to miss. When you talk about the strategy, and we want to talk a little bit now about the competition. Before we go there, you said there are certain things you wouldn't buy the t-shirt. Let's say tell me two things, two elements of the SAP strategy that you would buy the t-shirt. And two of the slogans where you definitely would refuse to put anything on.
Well, it's really the idea of getting me into a vendor T-shirt at this point is really, really tough. But I'll follow your lead here. I think that a lot of SAP strategy makes sense. It's how it translates into what's real for customers and what's real with the experience that customers have of SAP's account executives in the field, and all of that can be very different than the enlightened discussions you might have with their leadership sometimes. But the thing that I really do like is the end-to-end process vision that's being presented, and SAP is, with the business data cloud, SAP is able to get pretty geeky into the data conversation as well. And that's so important because good AI is really dependent on quality data. And now I think SAP has some pretty viable answers to that. Now, granted, there's probably a lot of people that are weary about all the different products and the different names and all of that. And I get that. But the point is, like, SAP is able to have that conversation at SAP Connect, which was a really interesting show, trying to connect these lines of business and Muhammad Alam getting on stage, and I think he's a very credible speaker if you haven't watched that keynote. And
Absolutely.
and look at how they're connecting everything from the CX side all the way through. And here's why that matters for AI at the moment is because when you look at agents and what agents can and can't do, and I study this in a very, very geeky way. I read white papers and listen to like deep dives on YouTube. Agent to agent communication across vendors is very much an unanswered question.
Yeah.
Now, there are these protocols that are emerging like A2A, but it's just not clear how well these agents are going to do that. And I need a lot more proof points that this is actually a realistic thing in the next few years, because what happens is the context can get lost, and the context in an agentic system is everything. Whereas if you're within an environment, it's much more easy on the same platform to have those conversations. So, one solution is to put everything on the same data platform. So, for example, at BDC, SAP could pull data from other vendors into that, and then you could build agentic workflows on top of that. But those would be analytical and informational workflows more than transactional workflows, if that makes sense. So it doesn't solve the problem of activating transactions in different applications and stuff like that. So at the moment, having more of an end-to-end view is a compelling value proposition. Now, I would argue that SAP needs to continue to focus on integration, which has been a strong theme, so give them credit for that. But for example, if you compare to Oracle, which SAP would hate me to do, well, Fusion Cloud is much more built on one platform. Now, there are some acquisitions, like smaller ones in CX and stuff on the Oracle side, but it's much more one software program than SAP's collection of end-to-end processes is amongst many different SaaS acquisitions. So the integration challenge there is harder. But SAP's taking it seriously, and I think that end to end is compelling. Where I would not wear the T-shirt is the suite first thing.
Okay.
I don't like sweet talk all that much. No pun intended. I think I think it harkens to me anyway, feelings of lock-in and feelings of monolithic applications. Now, if you listen to how SAP talks about it, they will very, very quickly talk about modular suites. And they want to, they're not trying to use the suite in the classic lock-in way. I just think it's a dirty word. I think it's hard to I think it's hard to fix the word. I think suite as a service is sort of interesting though, because it implies a time, and this gets back to your AI first conversation. I think it implies a time where there's less and less HR, FI, whatever, and more like composable processes that you can consume from different vendors. And we're not there yet, but those would become the agentic building blocks in a way where you would pull these workflows and these automation from different vendors. And that would be more suite as a service than it would be interacting like a user inside of a suite. So I understand what SAP's saying and why SAP wants to make this case, but I think SAP does need to recognize, and this, again, this is a Josh Greenbaum point around the heterogeneous enterprise and all the different applications in play. And SAP, I think, wants to make a stronger statement that we do play nice with other applications and we can work with other applications data on our data platform now and all of that. And so anyway, I have pretty mixed feelings about that phrase, but SAP has chosen that hill. It's going to take a stand on that hill, and we will find out if I'm right or wrong on. And honestly, I haven't had a chance to talk with enough customers around it, but I do think that the customers do want to pick vendors they work closely with and trust. And so if that's what they're taking from that messaging, then maybe SAP is getting it right, and maybe I'm wrong.
When you say like most customers will choose the vendors they are close to, there are some opinions saying like if you look at the competitive landscape, you have Oracle, you have SAP, and so on. We are basically an oligopoly, yeah, where when you are once on SAP, you are on SAP, and when you are once on Oracle, you are on Oracle, and these kinds of interconnections, yeah, where somebody would move to another platform and so on, the probability is actually not very high because the risk and the costs and everything, yeah, would basically not justify this kind of radical move in most of the cases. I'm not painting black and white. Do you agree with that kind of situation?
Yeah, look, there are exceptions to that because of merger and acquisition activity where suddenly you have clashing platforms and you have to decide between them. And in many cases they're capable, and like as SAP is still the most global of, if we limit the conversation to SAP, Oracle, and Workday for a moment, SAP is the most global of the three, though Oracle isn't that far behind in many cases. Workday is trying to be more global, but in work, they're all like, Workday's a little less manufacturing, much more focused on services industries, but in general, like, there's overlapping. And so if you have like different companies operating different ones, they may have to standardize, and that may be political fight more than anything, who knows, and then you do have to make the move. But in general, you are right, and I think right now there's very, very little appetite for big platform moves for their own sake. And Josh and I are doing a business case workshop next week, and the big thing around that is you always have to rationalize your investments in technology in business terms now, and not just multi-year terms, but month by month. You have to show what you're getting out of it. And there's much more of an appetite for move quickly. But I think what you will find some of is companies that want to attack a particular area and choose a different platform for that area. So maybe they want to build a bunch of customer facing apps or improve like their omni-channel experience for customers, and maybe they start pulling in a different vendor for that, and then that becomes a platform that's part of the picture, and they start integrating with their other platform. They won't have 20 different platforms, but they might have 2 or 3, and then over time what happens is that the platform that delivers the most value, it's much more what they call a land and expand game. And customers don't really like that terminology because they feel like they're being colonized. I totally get that. But from a customer perspective, it's about who do I like working with? Who's got the software that's most intuitive for my users? How do I roll out applications the fastest? And once you start seeing that, I do think there are like that, you can kind of get sort of lose from within over time, right? And so that's kind of what was happening at SAP a few years ago, where you would start to see like, oh, here's Coupa taking some of the procurement business, here's a CX player taking some of the CX business. And so it wasn't like you said of a huge rip and replace, but it was more like different SaaS vendors moving in and taking little chunks. And
Yeah.
but I think that's changing a little bit right now, and that's where SAP's suite messaging maybe come in, which is right now the focus has shifted more to AI and data platform considerations. And now companies are taking a little bit of a step back from just picking their SaaS vendor du jour, and thinking a little harder about what the data platform implications are of these decisions, and how many vendors can they rightfully serve and still pull off these workflows. Because what SAP says is that across the stack, we have the best applications in each area. I think that's a stretch, because I think it's impossible to have the best applications in every area for every customer. That's not how it works. But I think what SAP could say, which would be even more effective, is look, the end to end is so powerful for AI right now, because you need this workflow standardization if you want to further automate stuff quickly. Otherwise, you have agents talking to agents, and who's managing that? Who's dealing with that? Who's orchestrating that? There are vendors that say they're going to be able to do that, whether you could look at Boomi or UiPath or ServiceNow. These are three of the most interesting vendors to look at in terms of how they claim to orchestrate stuff. And they're all very interesting, but I think overall orchestrating across vendors is proven to be challenging.
Who would you say, which competitor should SAP currently most worry about? Is it a competitor on the ERP space, or is something from a completely different space? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I mean, I think like there's a difference between learn from and worry about, right? So for example, I think SAP could learn some things from, for example, how Acumatica approaches their industry solutions. I think SAP could learn from how even how Zoho approaches some things around AI, because they're a privately held company. They have a they do all their stuff in house ultimately, although Zoho does work with external LLMs, but they're building their own. And I think it's interesting to look at companies that are very distinct. And Acumatica, for example, has a really effective consumption-based pricing scheme that I think is going to work really well for AI stuff. But anyway, in terms of who they should worry about, I think I would put it this way. I think they should pay attention to Oracle and Workday. They should pay attention to Workday because Workday has a really interesting claim around that they're going to serve up the best AI because they have everyone. They claim they have the most standardized data model in the industry for AI on a public cloud format. I think SAP should watch that, not necessarily worry about it, but watch it and see how Workday does with that. With Oracle, I think they should pay attention to what Oracle is doing with the combination of infrastructure and apps, and pay attention to that as well, because what Oracle can do there by owning so much of the stack, SAP should pay attention to that. But as far as who SAP should worry about, in the worry sense, I think they should worry about any vendor that's trying to orchestrate agents, because I don't know how successful that's going to be, but if and I'm skeptical, like I said, of the ability to do that at this point in time. But if you end up being the trusted orchestration vendor, then you're going to have a whole lot of power, control, and trust over all the people. I've kind of said that if that plays out, then the other vendors become a series of API calls and underlying automations that are invoked. And so in that regard, I would say ServiceNow, UiPath, and Boomi. And I'm aware that UiPath and SAP work closely together, so that's a little bit tricky, but sometimes friends and enemies are tricky.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think now...
And you know, that UiPath and ServiceNow both are led by former SAP executives who know SAP very, very well. Yeah.
Yep.
In that case.
Yep. And there's a lot of knowledge, and Boomi as well. Steve Lucas, CEO.
Exactly. Yeah.
Steve Lucas knows some stuff. I just met with Steve last week and included some of that in an article. So anyway, like I'd be keeping an eye on those vendors. I don't know how much of a threat that will ultimately become, but I think you have to pay attention to that, because if those vendors convincingly gain control of everyone else's stacks and apps through their interface, then that's a tremendous amount of power.
What does this all mean for partners, this kind of, let's say, happening in that way? Because we see like partners are once focused on one vendor. Some add, let's say, maybe an Salesforce here, or maybe something like an Anaplan on the other side. But there are, let's say, if you're not one of the big four, there are, let's say, some longer lasting relationships there which do not really change. Do you see, based on the orchestration vendors, do you see some way that partners should engage themselves more heavily? Because in the partner space, yeah, these companies are a little bit out of the game from my perspective. Yeah, everybody's talking about the core, everybody's talking about the architecture and so on, but there is this kind of playing field, yeah, the orchestrator playing field, which is happening completely unnoticed by most of the SAP implementation partners. Is this something you see, based on this kind of future possibilities, a massive weakness that most of the SAP partners show in that respect?
So I think the most important thing for SAP partners is to really start making sure that they've adapted their business models in a BTP/BDC friendly way, uh, so that they can really be on board with that type of messaging, and really like serve as advisors, trusted advisors to customers on how to move towards more standard deployments, when to customize, when to differentiate, all of that. Like the most important thing is to modernize in that capacity, and kind of develop, I think, a combination of internal expertise, IP, last mile function, all of that. That's crucially important. But when you talk about across vendors, I do think the and I don't think it's because I would say do this because SAP is necessarily in trouble. I mean, I have raised a number of criticisms, but I would do that about any vendor that you ask me about. I think overall I've been surprised by how much SAP has executed well on what it's set out to do in this so-called AI era so far. So like I think overall, you know, SAP is definitely like not relegated itself to a client server afterthought or anything like that. Like whether you decide to go down the road with all of their tools or not, I think they've done a pretty good job of articulating a forward strategy. But like, so I'm not saying abandon ship or anything like that, but I do think having your fingers in multiple ecosystems makes sense. I think it makes you better at what you do. I think it makes you more versatile. I think you can learn things from one and apply it to another. You don't want to get spread too thin. But I do think the most interesting vendors that I've talked with, partners in the last year, are playing in more than one ecosystem, but they might find more action in one than another. One of the really interesting ones I'm about to write about is an Oracle partner who, interestingly enough, discovered exactly what I was talking about, because this partner started building agents and figured out that Oracle was much better than some of the other SaaS. They don't work with SAP, but was much better than other vendors they were working with, because it's more end to end. They were able to do more with agents across processes because of that end-to-end capability. So, it's interesting. They found that out because they were in more than one ecosystem, and that gave them an ability to test demand for their stuff across software. So it does make sense to me that you would do that, but not get spread too thin, because more and more these days, especially with AI and stuff, it becomes really important to be certified and to spend enough time, as we discussed, making sure you're discoverable by these ecosystems. And so you don't want to get spread too thin, but I do think it's good to be involved in multiple ecosystems.
looking at the multiple ecosystems, and you have probably one of the best overviews over there. Do you see any differences in agility, for example, where you see like, there is really innovation happening. There's really actual things going on, with customers really getting to do things they are not doing before, while other ecosystems really more care about, okay, we have here, let's say, platform changes, but it's just carry over legacy solutions, legacy processes. Where do you think is the fire burning strongest at the moment?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, I think like historically, Salesforce was my bellwether. Um,
Mhm.
they were my standard for what I thought was the most thriving community, not just of software developers and ISVs, but also line of business community.
Mhm.
I think, if you do some searches of the headlines, you'll see that Salesforce has faced a lot of challenges to that the last couple of years.
Is it
Um,
because they suddenly are now in the position that they also have a serious installed base, and as such are getting installed base OEM problems like all have? Like I have now, I cannot just pull out new stuff, but I have to take care to move along the ones I have.
I think some of that is part of it,
Yeah.
but I think some of it is the presence of an activist investor,
Mhm.
um, kind of pushing them for, operational efficiencies and, you know, community can survive that push, but that's a whole different conversation.
Mhm.
But in the short version of that conversation, because I think it's important to mention this, is that the way you save and revive communities these days is not by saying that KPIs don't matter, but by insisting that you measure the right things. And if you can measure the health of communities and the impact on things like upselling, customer retention, uh, reduction in support inquiries is an obvious one, but there are a bunch of things you can do to measure the health of a community. But problem is most vendors don't do it. Salesforce does a pretty good job on this front, but Salesforce has just like faced a lot of different challenges in terms of who it is as a company and values versus like what protecting its public sector business. How vocal should they be about their values when they're trying to protect public sector business in the current U.S. environment? For example, these are
Mhm.
not easy things for any vendor to navigate right now.
Yeah.
Um, so um, so they were kind of one of my standards, but yeah, I mean, I'm mostly disappointed in all the larger vendors in terms of like what they do to energize smaller partners versus what they could be doing. And I'm pushing mostly all of them on that. But I do usually see the healthiest ecosystems are with smaller um, software vendors that can have more like kind of personal touch stuff and but larger vendors could do this too. You and I talked a little bit about this, but it has to do with like having a more robust experience with your partners where you're having really open communications and talking openly about like here's what we're doing on our roadmap and here's the gaps, because the best vendors what they're doing is they're telling their partners not only here's what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, but like here's what we're hearing from customers, what they need that we're not providing. There's gaps you could fill. Like this kind of thing. It's like it's hard to put a finger on exactly, but you can tell when it's missing. And so often it does seem to be very transactional right now. And, I understand why vendors get into transactional partner like, relationships, but in the long run, we're supposed to be talking about customer success. And so I always use customer success. Vendors don't like this, but I take the term and use it to kind of like I turn it on them and say, well, if it's customer success, then where are the partners making a difference here? And why aren't I talking to those partners and
Mhm.
hearing about how they're changing implementations to make them like more not only more efficient but like get a better result versus these fast track methodologies that often lead to fast go lives but poor results in the long run. So I'm always looking to have those conversations. So I don't know if I can point to one. I mean, I think Workday's approach is intriguing because they were admittedly very slow on ecosystem and were very controlling, and now they're much more aggressively opening it up. And I think that's created some energy for them because now partners getting excited about what they can do. But whether they can sustain that or not will be interesting because it's like a shift in tone. So right now they're in kind of a honeymoon period with that, where I get a lot of energy from those partners. So, but every vendor ultimately has challenges here. And I don't think I can say like, oh, here's your role model.
Probably a lot of this kind of, let's say, struggle that smaller SAP partners have at the moment in their relationship with SAP itself is that SAP at the moment is trying, of course, heavily to push their partners into a new business model, which is not just implementing the stuff, but also of, let's say, reselling or selling subscriptions or support the sale of subscription, which many partners say that is not our business model. And it's also one case where partner organizations at the moment tend to behave more like sales organizations than the partner organizations that they have been before. With the conversations changing more to an account planning sure fix, then into what some in the past has been the typical sure fix of SAP as its partners. Customer success coming in there, which would mean adoption, but in many cases you get the feeling that adoption is sometimes not seen as customer success, but sales is actually seen as adoption, no matter if you actually use it or not. What is your opinion about that actual state? Is it just something of an development which is natural and had to happen, or is it something where you see the end is not yet written in that book?
I mean, it feels like some things need to change. I mean, it feels like there's some like SAP has clearly articulated a clean core and BTP methodology that's at the heart of how to deal with at least their ERP install base going forward with business models. That's not going to change, and so partners are going to need to figure out how to make that work one way or the other. But I don't know that the work is done. It feels like there needs to be some kind of more open discussion around what this all means that everyone can be a part of. And I don't get the sense that happens from what I hear from partners on the back channel. So I personally like the direction that SAP is taking there in terms of what it means for customers in the long run. So I want to be clear about that. But I also think that, like I said, you really want to harness that field energy of partners and you know, you need to figure out how to create this differentiating thing that you do for customers, but then building that into a viable business model, like you said. And I've seen a lot of partners make this transition in the SaaS era where they realized that ultimately recurring subscription revenue was a pretty excellent model, but they did have to change some things, right? Because it wasn't so much I'm dedicated to one project. A lot of times they were managing multiple projects and doing stuff more remotely. And how you guide people through those changes, for example, can be tricky. And I don't have all the solutions. I mean, I'm not going to be able to unfortunately fix the SAP partner ecosystem and during our discussions today. And I really wish I could, because there's so much cool stuff happening. And I love hearing from these partners that there's so many cool partners. I could rattle off a bunch of names. I feel like maybe I shouldn't, but there's so many out there that I hear from that are just doing amazing stuff. And, ultimately, I have a vision of Project Health where the customer, the key partners in SAP all have like some real-time metrics that they've all agreed upon, kind of like what you have on your wrist for your own health, that everyone looks at and can discuss openly and say, not necessarily like, oh, this red is bad, but like, hey, why are we in the red on this one indicator? Like, is there something going on? And, maybe it's a totally normal explanation, or maybe there's something that needs to change. But so much about how projects go wrong historically in ERP, when you read the headlines, you always come back from these articles saying like, how did they go 18 months without coming up for air and saying there's a problem here? And I think like we have so much technology now to allow us to do this in real time. And so if I'm a partner, I start thinking about customer success as a real-time discipline and how can I begin to do that? And I've actually talked with a couple SAP partners that have built some tools that help them to do kind of what I'm describing. And ultimately, I think the vendor needs to own these tools, like in the broadest sense, but I would encourage partners to think about how they can innovate around customer health and customer success in new, fresh ways. And, I don't know all the solutions, but I do think if you are making a difference for customers, eventually you can win. I don't know how that win happens, but I would say stay laser focused on that, and maybe you'll be okay. I mean, one thing I'm really looking for in tech ed season is how will we advance some with our AI tooling? Because I think some partners have some really great tools to automate, not just with AI, but variety of ways to automate these transitions. Because we need to make these transitions to the latest version of SAP much easier, right? Outside the context of all the things you and I talked about today around the transformation and having the right kind of conversation about that. Once you decide to go forward, it should be easy. It shouldn't be hard, right? And Grant, look, I mean, these things are never going to be easy like the red easy button, but they should be a hell of a lot easier than they are now. SAP knows that and has said all the right things. And at Sapphire, they started to roll out some of the tools for that. I'm not just interested in SAP's tools. I'm interested in what partners can do. And there's a lot of partners that do some cool stuff with this. We just have to make this easier for customers to make these moves. And my hope would be, and I could be wrong here, but my hope would be that would be one of the overriding conversations of tech ed season, is to have a collective conversation around this with SAP, all kinds of partners. How, when customers want to move forward with this, how can they make it easy? To me, that's the top conversation. And the second most top conversation for tech ed season would be, if I'm not ready to make a big move right now, how can I innovate now immediately in my current landscape with SAP? Because SAP has to be able to answer that question also. And they know that.
Mhm.
And their answers to that question have gotten better. I documented some of that on my SAP Connect articles. But that's the whole thing, because for a long time I was excoriating SAP on this point, because I felt like they were saying, like, until you complete your big cloud migration, you're not going to be able to consume any of our cool stuff. That's a huge mistake in messaging. There's actually a
Yeah.
lot that an ECC customer can do. They can't do everything. Maybe they can't do certain Joule things, but they can do a lot of things, and BTP is one avenue to those things. So that's the second most important conversation, is how can I innovate right now if I'm not ready to move? So we need to have those two conversations. And if you're a partner and you can answer both of those, I think that's awesome, because, what I keep saying to SAP around this is, like, you want to give people a flavor for SAP as an innovation partner. You don't want to have to say, oh, well, eventually you're going to be able to innovate, but first you got to make this big move. That doesn't work anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And looking at the time space 2026,
Yeah.
2027, is that getting the things done more easily your top conversation or your top point that SAP has to achieve in that years?
So that's a big one. I don't know if that's the only one. I mean, this is the kind of thing, a walk and chew gum, like a vendor like SAP has to do a whole lot. I think integration's the other really big one. They have to, if they're going to do this end-to-end thing that seems pretty compelling, they really have to deliver on that. If it's a suite, it has to behave like a suite. So SAP has really raised the bar for themselves there. Um, I expect a lot more.
That's a problem with all those new messages and so on. Yeah, you have to deliver on them, and whenever you
Yeah.
put on a new message, you put pressure at first on yourself. That's definitely so.
Yeah, I call it the buzzword boomerang effect, because it comes back
Yeah.
around on you. And now you're saying that all this is a suite. Well, okay, prove it. Like, prove that it is. Because your competitors, uh, your main competitors, have some fully integrated stuff that they built themselves. Now, everyone's got acquisitions to contend with, so no one's perfect anymore. But the point is, like, prove it. Prove you got the suite. So I think that's pretty big. And yeah, I think the promise of this tool chain is real, but I just have some differences in terms of, like, how far along it is. I think that's a big one, because that goes along with the integration messaging. I do think that SAP needs to find a way to make some of the Signavio process analysis stuff free. SAP is going to love this part of the conversation, because I know I know they like monetizing Signavio, but I think there's got to be a way to monetize some of it, but make some of it free, because I think it's so important to give your customers visibility as they're considering these projects into the process area. So I think that's going to be one that I'll be
It's
watching
fantastic
as well.
appetizer. It's a fantastic appetizer, yeah, to
Yep.
get into the vision of, hey, what's actually possible, yeah. And
don't you want to have those process conversations with customers easily, right?
Yeah.
Like when in the pre-sales mentality of like what's next with your SAP landscape, don't you want to sit down with an analysis of all these processes and say, here's what we're dealing with? I think you have to look at, even if you have to take a monetization hit. And I'm not so sure that you do, because I think you could probably find a way to, I've seen good examples of how you can tie free and premium together, but I think you have to, if you're SAP, you have to find a way to make those conversations easy.
And if you want to go into pre-study, you at first you have still the discussion, where do we host it, where do we run it, and so on. And this should not be the case, yeah, because it means that for days you do not talk about the benefits, you do not talk about the process and about the step you want to make forward, yeah. And this is something where we really have to become better, from my perspective, in that way, yeah, to make the entrance and the transformation actual fun. The fun factor is just too covered still by so many tech discussions that nobody really understands still.
And if I can add one more quick thing to the list, I think it would be like one of the things SAP has been doing is sort of like doing more interesting on the ground events in the SAP Connect, and to some extent kind of bringing back some of the tech ed on the ground vibe from the pandemic and stuff. But I think we need to now step back from that and look at how can we cultivate year-round conversations with these topics. And this is one reason why I love podcasts like yours, because it really contributes to the necessary conversation we all need to be having. No one has all the answers. If anything is clear from our conversation, it's that no one has all the answers, right? I mean, I think you and I probably opened up more cans of worms than we resolved, and that's how this goes. And so we need to have these conversations year round, and we need more engaging dynamic events where people can easily interact and not just sit and listen to keynotes. And we need to cultivate this throughout the year, because these problems are ongoing, and they're continuous now, and we have to adapt. And I don't think like just being on LinkedIn is a solution to that. And I don't have all the solutions, because I realize that it's hard to get people to move off of LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever it is that they hang out on. But I think we have to figure out how to have a year-round community conversation, because so many of the topics you talked about require an openness, and it's not enough to kind of have partner messaging day and the partners come and hear the messaging. This has to be a constant conversation, and maybe the user groups need to align more around this. I know the German and North American user groups have been working more closely together. For example, in UK ISUG, they combined on some studies. We have to like really engage better as a community to solve these problems, because they are big problems.
And it doesn't always have to be those huge, expensive events. Yeah, it's the smaller events. Yeah, where
on the ground stuff
happens.
In the old inside track vibe, stuff happening on the ground locally. I used to love some of the inside tracks used to do like a virtual stream where you could pile on and listen virtually. That was really cool. Hang out in the chat. And the final thing I just want to say about SAP, is that I think SAP has a chance in the next decade to be one of the most important global companies, because like right now there's so much divisive conflict in the world, and I don't think the US big tech companies are providing what I would call true global leadership. They're doing a great job of consolidating wealth and power. We can talk about how much of a bubble that is, but I really think we need companies that have global perspective on global problems. And SAP has historically been a company that could really bring a message, I think, of diversity and global engagement across many nations, and be kind of a mature voice. Like I'm not asking SAP to take big political stands, but a mature voice across countries and cultures. SAP's always been really good at that. I think if SAP can keep that as a core thing, it can really make a global difference as a brand. And I really believe that. I worry a little bit sometimes that SAP is losing some of that in terms of the pressure from the marketplace and stuff. But if SAP can retain that, I think it could become like a really, really important company, because you think about SAP more like, oh, past glories. But when you think about it, what do we need now more than a global mature company that doesn't get caught up in political games and regional skirmishes, and can like really bring a diverse group of constituents together working towards the same goals? I mean, I know it sounds simple, but we don't have enough of that in the world right now. And so that's my biggest hope for SAP. I think a lot of its leadership understands that. We could question where some of the dynamic female leaders in SAP wind up, because they don't always seem to wind up on the board level, unfortunately. But in general, like, I think that's where SAP could go. So
Definitely. And it's the problem that we have in our society, in our world at max. Yeah, we do not talk enough with each other at the moment, more about each other, but definitely not with each other. And that's what you definitely should change.
well, thank you for sparking that, and thank you for pushing me to try to bring my A game today. It was really awesome to talk with you.
Absolutely.
Did we cover everything? Did we cover everything from your notes?
No, definitely not. And to be honest, I will ask you to have something of a second part of this conversation. Maybe when the next year has been started and we know more about the strategy 2026. But of course, when folks want to get into contact with you, when they want to meet you and get into conversation and learn from you, is your travel season already at its end, or do you still have something up to do?
Well, like I said, I'll be at ASUG Tech Connect. So if you're there, although by the time this podcast comes out, ASUG Tech Connect could be over, so I don't want to rush you there. But I will be there, and then I've got one more event. Then I'm off the road, so you probably are best to. I know I bashed LinkedIn on this episode, but that's the best way to start connecting with me. So find me there. I'm still on X/Twitter as well, if you prefer that. I'm not sure exactly like what I accomplished there. I'm on Blue Sky also, which is okay. So anyway, find me wherever you want, connect. Love to hear from y'all. I always learn from the feedback I get. So
awesome. We put the links in the notes so people can get into contact with you. And Jon, was great to have you. Awesome conversation. Really learned a lot, and I'm looking already forward to the next one.
Cool. Thanks for doing what you do, and look forward to catching up again.
Thank you very much.